I'm interested in pattern-forming systems, and I put up this picture of the type of pattern I'm going to be talking about today. I call this a pattern because I think all of us, looking at it, we might agree that there's some kind of typical length in it, that it has some length scale associated with it. I didn't put a scale bar on it, but I will show you a scale bar in a second. But we might all be able to agree sort of on what that length scale is once I put the scale bar on. And we might also agree that there's some preferred direction in it. Okay, so I'm calling this a pattern. It's not like a perfect crystal or something, but that's what I'm interested in. Okay, so here's the scale bar. I don't know what you thought you were looking at. I'll tell you, though, what it is that this is a photograph from 1952. It was from an aerial survey of the vegetation in the Horn of Africa. So over Somalia and Ethiopia, they were doing this. And so the scale of this is enormous. And what you're actually looking at in these dark regions is that's where the vegetation is. And in the light, there's no vegetation, or approximately no vegetation. So this is a dryland ecosystem phenomena where vegetation ends up being concentrated into these patches here. Okay. Here's the global distribution of drylands. It makes up quite a bit of the globe, and there's a concentration, like a classification of how arid regions are. What I want to point out, though, is how these are defined. Okay, so this is not necessarily a mathematical definition, but there was this paper by Neumeier that was trying to sort of lay out what are drylands, and he sort of talks about it like defining it, and that drylands are water-limited ecosystems. That's trying to be indicated here with this. And then the other thing he goes on to say as part of this definition is that they have infrequent, discrete, and largely unpredictable water inputs. And he talks about this in a way like that if you think about living systems and that they have to get different nutrients or energies, or like if we're thinking about vegetation, they need to get sunlight and different nutrients from the soils and stuff like that, that usually those would be sort of continuous quantities. And in contrast, these water inputs that are limiting the growth of these ecosystems are just these pulses. And we don't really know when they're going to occur and how big they're going to be. And so that quote kind of, this is a mathematical modeling talk, just to warn you. And that's going to be what drives a lot of what we're trying to do, is to capture some of these features. Okay, as I mentioned, this is a phenomenon that people have known about since they were doing these aerial surveys over this region of Somalia and Ethiopia in the late 40s, 50s, and so on. So this was one of the first published papers, was a paper by McFadden in 1950, where he has these photographs, once he was up in the air. And he said, like, if you were on the ground, you would not be able to recognize this. You wouldn't know. Like, there's that woman on the ground, and she's standing near the edge of one of these vegetation bands, and she might not know, like, oh, they're organized in this fashion. So it was only when you got up above it that you could see that. Other things I'll point out on this, there's an arrow here. We said like there's these stripe patterns, and they've got some orientation, and that's approximately perpendicular to an elevation grade, so that's pointing in a downhill direction. So when these rare storms come in, the water's going to flow downhill. Yeah, so there's the scale bar. The other thing I'd like to point out in this other photograph, I have this like black stuff, and I say, oh, that's vegetation. And when I get to modeling, I'm just going to treat it like a single field, biomass field. But you can see that it's actually like a very rich community, that there's grasses and shrubs and trees. Stephanie.
Sorry, just for clarification, how steep is the elevation gradient?
Yeah, there has to be it's a sweet spot, in my opinion. Like, people have measured that, like they found different locations. And the sweet spot seems to be a very gentle grade. Like the semi-desert plains, this is almost flat. And in fact, if you read what they write about there when they were studying it, they said you couldn't really tell where the downhill direction is. So it's maybe like 0.5% grade, like definitely less than 2%. So if I talk about like, oh, there's like a slope, I should do it like this. There's a slope. Yeah. Okay, so people have studied this and looked at, it's not just in this, oh, yes, Oni.
Sorry. Just wanted to ask, is there any difference in rock, the underlying,
Yeah, surely
basalt
there
versus
are
sand?
some things that happen also because there's water flowing and it could create different things. And so I don't want to say that there isn't, but in this McFadden paper, this first one, he kind of says like he says like it's like a weird topic to be studying. It is like a weird topic. Sorry, it's the end of the day. I'm doing this weird topic. And he says like it doesn't really, it's not botany, it's not geography or, it's, but and then he goes on and says it's like sort of, okay, I think what he says is it's mathematics. Sorry, I don't have the quote, but he basically says this is something that's emergent. In a modern language, you would say it's something emergent. So, and that's definitely the point of view I will take and that other people have taken, that it's some kind of self-organization that's going on. Yes, Thomas. I think a lag. If you want to ask a question, there's like this lag while people...
Oh, now it's on.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
If these patterns as they arise, they don't happen at exactly the same spots, right? So even though you're talking about these slopes, the ground shifts a lot and these are moving or reform periodically in different spots, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and maybe at the very end I'll mention some thoughts around this. Okay, but anyway, this was a paper where they went and looked at where they collected different examples of these spatially periodic patterns all around the globe. And the only reason I show it is it's not, I showed you this map of the drylands. It's not like you can just go to any dryland and find these. There are other features besides being dry. It seems to be also hot. And what I say is flat or almost flat. And there's a variety of patterns that people have studied. I'm focusing entirely on these, I don't know, let me see if I can do this. No. Okay, these kind of stripy ones, and when I do the modeling, I'm going to really, the thing that's nice about stripes is you could maybe do something like a transect and you've got a one-dimensional problem. Okay, but there's spot patterns. There's all sorts of things people have studied, and I'm only studying one aspect of this. We have looked not only in this Horn of Africa region, but there's also nice examples from Australia and also Texas and Mexico. Yeah?
Where's E?
What?
E. The panel E. It's a cool pattern. It's not, I just wanted to know where it was.
90 East?
Where in the
No,
world
there's
is
panel E there.
Oh.
That's a pattern representation.
Maybe it's up underneath panel E.
No. Okay, I'll make up something that's in Namibia. Okay, I'm just, yeah, you can look at this. I mean, this was a paper where they collected all of this data. This is a very nice, I would say this is a field where it's modeling rich and observationally poor. But this group, this Belgian group, has done a lot of the work where they actually went and looked at things. Okay. So going back historically, with these explorers or whatever, or colonists, not explorers, okay, so they were there doing ground-based studies as well. So this is one from Hemming from the Anti-Locust Research Center. And what I want to do now is I'm going to step back and I want to talk about timescales for this problem. Okay, so switching gears, I'm about to get to modeling. I want to talk about timescales. So he was studying this. You can see he mapped it out and said, what is the actual direction of maximum slope? Everything mapped out each bush and tree. But he makes this observation that these vegetation arcs are actually migrating upslope, okay, via colonization. We're not seeing shrubs moving along, but there's upslope colonization that goes on and die off at the trailing edge. And he estimates, based on his ground-based study, what is the rate of that migration. A lot of us mathematicians, we turn this into like a traveling wave problem, just to warn you. Like there's some kind of traveling wave and it has some speed, spatially periodic traveling wave with some speed. Says it's moving so that this particular arc, which is about 18 meters wide, would be displaced by 18 meters over the ensuing century. Okay, so the dynamics associated with this biomass, I'm going to claim, is very slow. You know, that would maybe talk about decades or something. I have to show this movie. What this is a movie from Karanagauda, who some people know is a microbial ecologist now, but he started out as an applied mathematician. He was my PhD student at Northwestern, and what you're seeing is 3 snapshots in time that he put together in this kind of movie. I'm just cycling them, 1, 2, 3. The color one is the most recent one, 2006. He's got 1952. There were declassified spy satellite data from 67 that he also had. And the amazing thing, the reason I like to show this is he did such a beautiful job of the georeferencing of this, you know. And you can measure you can now test Hemming's prediction. It was good, you know. So, okay, so now I'm going to switch to the way I want to think about this problem is that I have this consumer, which is the vegetation, and I have this resource, which is the water. And I just was talking about, like, okay, the vegetation is very slow dynamics. Things don't change very much over decades. I want to also talk about this water, okay? So this is from another study. This one was in Mexico, and they took a transect through one of these vegetation bands, and over the course of the year, they measured storms, and they measured soil water content at different locations through the band. Okay, so the thing I want to point out, the top line there is showing the storms. And they're spikes. Okay, so a storm is a short-lived event. I'm going to treat them as just instantaneous when I get to the modeling, that it instantaneously deposits water on the surface. And you can see that leads to this sharp uptick in the amount of water in the soil, and then some kind of slower decay due to evaporation and transpiration. The other thing I want to point out here is that this picture beautifully shows the feedback that's associated with this phenomena. Because if you look in this region where there's the vegetated zone, the soil moisture spikes way up when there's a storm. If you look at the downslope region, it's hardly getting any of the water. So there is a positive feedback between vegetation and this water uptake that's essential here. So if I could somehow, I don't have enough water to feed this whole region, but I could maybe take a little patch. If that could concentrate all of the water from the surrounding region in it, that would be like a good mechanism for survival there. Okay, so these timescales are very rapid. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the modeling we're doing, and I want to give it some context from some other people's work. Okay, so this was a paper that appeared, a kind of review paper in Science, Evasion of Tipping in Complex Systems Through Spatial Pattern Formation. So this is a paper that came out. Max Rieckirch is a theoretical ecologist. Arjen Dolman is an applied mathematician. So it's this very productive collaboration of this Dutch group of mathematicians and ecologists. And this is, from their studies, they drew this kind of cartoon of what's going on. And what they're contrasting is if I have a spatially homogeneous system, and I imagine decreasing the amount of water that's available, at some point there's not enough water and the system's going to collapse. I'm trying to do everything spatially homogeneous. And the evasion that can happen is if I somehow before this tipping point where everything collapses, if I could go into this spatially heterogeneous state, maybe I could survive for longer. Okay, so that's their message, like heterogeneity is going to help the system live for longer. Okay, and I put a glossary here because they have these terms. Okay, so a tipping point, there are lots of tipping point mechanisms that people have identified. The one they're talking about here is the classic one of a bifurcation. So there's a saddle node bifurcation in that one. Okay, so that one people have probably seen. Another one people may have seen is this Turing bifurcation right here. That is the point at which, that is a generic mechanism for creating spatially periodic patterns. So that's a well-known mechanism. It creates these things. And then they have this large gray region that they're calling the Busa balloon. This is taking terminology from fluid mechanics. Okay, Busa studied hydrodynamic convection. Okay, they're taking that term and applying it here. And what that represents, I'm going to show it over here. This is the usual way that you would do it. Well, not with this balloon, but the idea is that there's environmental conditions, whatever, you're less stressed, more stressed, and there's this region where you can form stable, spatially periodic states. And these states could be characterized by their pattern wavelength. Okay, so those are not easy calculations to do, to figure out where do these stable, spatially periodic states exist. Okay, so anyway, those are terms, and I'm going to talk about what we do, but reference back to this. Okay, so another bit of context for why I might be why people might be interested in this, why I am, why other people are, is we're thinking about what happens to these kinds of ecosystems which might be kind of fragile under climate change. And so there are these many axes in which the climate system could be changing. Often in the studies that, this vast literature I've told you about that's modeling, usually what they do is they look at what happens as you decrease the mean annual precipitation. Okay, so that would be like, I want to move those boundaries I showed you, like this region is semi-arid and it becomes arid, or it's arid, it becomes hyper-arid. So that would be one thing people could do. And what we've really wanted to do in our recent work is to focus instead on that storm variability, because that's another thing that could be changing under climate change. There's also evidence of seasonality changing in some regions. Like in that region of Horn of Africa, they have 2 rainy seasons, and there's some decrease in the length of one of those. Okay, so anyway, there's these various axes. This is showing rainfall data from a location in Texas that's close to where some of these spatially periodic patterns happen. And this is showing daily rainfall, days between rain events, dry periods. And that leads to quite a distribution if you look at mean annual precipitation. So what I'm going to talk about is a modeling framework where we're going to treat the daily rainfall as drawn from an exponential distribution. That's a very crude precipitation model, but that's what we're going to do. And likewise, treat the storm arrival times as a Poisson process. So I'm going to also have an exponential distribution of dry days between storms. Okay, so finally I'm going to get to the modeling. There's a huge amount of modeling. I'm happy to give people references on it. I'm only going to mention 2 models before getting to mine. Or, yeah, the one that I want. Okay, and that's because these really influenced us and influenced a lot of other people. So the first model, the 2 models I'm going from are, one involves just 2 fields, biomass and water, and the other one's going to involve a 3rd field. And everything I'm going to do is also in that kind of context. So this is a model due to Klaus Meyer, who is an ecologist at Michigan State. And he wrote this paper, and it was hugely influential. Biomass, water, interacting. All the terms are linear with one exception. Precipitation, it's a control parameter. It's the mean annual precipitation, so that's just a constant. And I'll just point out that the way he puts in this infiltration feedback, where the water gets more concentrated where it's needed in the biomass, what he does is he's got this term, like if you think about the top one there, like that's a growth term. And you can think of it, there's a growth rate for the biomass. The growth rate, I would expect, it would depend on the water. So it's proportional to the amount of water. He threw in another factor of biomass to capture this feedback. So rather than just going like WB, an interaction between those, he adds in another factor of B. Okay, so anyway, this model, he estimates parameters, picks others out of a hat. He can get this pattern formation appearing. And in some ways, this isn't surprising to some people. Like, 'cause this is actually, under a coordinate transformation, the same as something called the Gray-Scott model that people studied for a long time. Okay, and it's known to produce rich patterns. Klausmeyer's done a ton of stuff like this. Okay, so I don't want to say like the guy's amazing. All the yeah. Okay, pointing to an ecologist. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So one thing that is confusing here, and so this is from this Max Riekert group, this group of Dutch ecologists. What they did is they basically said it's confusing to call it water because there's all these processes going on, and some things are associated with water on the surface, some things are associated with water in the soil. And so what they wanted to do was to separate that water field into two parts. One is water on the surface, the other one is water in the soil. Water's not on the surface much of the time. These are drylands. You don't go there and see water on the surface. So they just do a phenomenological slowing down of parameters to get this. But what they liked in this is that it allowed them to really think about this infiltration feedback. That's about how the water goes from the surface into the soil. And it's in that term, this is the feedback. There's none of this like B squared W or anything like that. You don't have to do that on the growth term then. And they also have just a mean precipitation parameter within this model. Okay, so that's their model. Now I can turn to ours that has stolen a bunch of things from these other people. Not stolen, but used. Benefited from it, yeah, yes. Inspired by them, yeah. Yeah, but nothing comes purely from our imagination. So anyway, the way that I'm going to frame this is as what some people have called like a flow kick model or an impulsive model or a switch system. I don't know, it goes by many different names. But the idea is that I'm going to have a system that's evolving just the biomass and the soil moisture together during the long dry periods between rain events. Okay, so I have water, biomass. The water is just disappearing from the system. The biomass is doing what it's doing. This is a very bare bones model. There's no feedbacks. I mean, I could make it fancier, but I'm not going to. It's like a minimalist model between these. And then there's the kicks, or these impulses, or what Neumeier called the pulses to the system, which are from the rain events. Okay, so the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to imagine that instantaneously I have a height of water H naught on the surface. Okay, I could let it rain and accumulate there. In this simplest version of it, I'm just going to deposit it uniformly on the surface, and that water is going to flow downhill, and it's going to infiltrate into the soil. And I'm going to put the feedbacks in here. The water is going to flow more rapidly over bare soil, and it's going to slow down when it gets to the shrubs and grasses. So they'll have some kind of surface roughness that'll slow down the water flow. And I'm also going to say that it infiltrates more slowly through soil crusts and stuff like that than it does in the places where there's vegetation. It could infiltrate more rapidly. So all these positive feedbacks that we understand to be important for this, they're in this part of the model. And what I want to get from this, okay, so other truths about this. Okay, I'm going to treat some things as random variables. The length of time I do the run my flow for the dry season. That's going to be random. And then this storm depth is another random variable. And so what we wanted to do was to come up with a caricature of the system. I don't want to be solving Navier-Stokes equations on a rough surface or something like that. This is just meant to be a real minimal model for this. So what we do is the following. We just say that the infiltration depends on the biomass distribution. I put that feedback in there. The flow speed depends on the biomass. I put in the surface roughness there. And notice these equations, there's no W on the right-hand side. That's going to simplify things. If I could just solve the top equation, I could, this is just a step function. Things are only infiltrating when there's something on the surface to infiltrate. I could just integrate that to get this. Okay, so this model is made up so that I could solve it. And you can write down solutions using method of characteristics. I can solve that H equation. So I'll tell you, just the punchline, what we get. Like there's the kick. It's spatially heterogeneous if there's biomass. Like here's biomass where it's green, yellow, there's none. And this is the initial height. Here are the characteristics. And what we do is we just integrate the water along the characteristics below this. It ends up being, and that gives you how much water gets deposited there. Okay, and so this is after the kick. There's the water distribution in the soil. Okay, so this is just set up so we can do lots of runs because we have a stochastic model of rainfall, so I need to be doing lots of these. You turn it on, oh my gosh, it like works. You know, like we worked with these hydrologists to come up with parameters, and so there wasn't a lot of like fiddling with it after, you know. So I'll show you what this is an example of. Here's our rainfall data, our synthetic rainfall data, just showing annual rainfall, largest storm. It's like all over the place. This is not a small amount of variability. It's highly variable. We start out, this is a space-time plot. On the horizontal is the x-coordinate. I'm doing a one-dimensional landscape. And we start out with just a little bit of noise on the surface, and it becomes banded. These bands emerge, and they travel uphill at a reasonable speed and have reasonable wavelengths and stuff. Okay, so anyway, it works. Okay, so now I want to turn to the analysis. I want to go back to those pictures from that science paper. Okay, so the first one, they had this tipping point. That was for the homogeneous case. We turn off all of the spatial terms. We just have ODEs. So this is just, I flow this ODE for some length of time. Then I give it an instantaneous kick, move it to some new place in phase space, and then evolve it again. If I did it with, I'm going to do two test cases. One is where I have periodic kicks. Every storm is identically the same, and it happens predictably. Irrigation or something like that. Okay, so this is the irrigation case, and then I have the real rainfall case, which is random. So in this, it settles into something. Here it flows, there it kicks. In my random case, this is in my biomass water phase space. I'm flowing, kicking, you know, it's like wandering all over the place. Okay, I don't have everything in my problem that gave feedbacks to it was in this sort of heterogeneous situation. So nothing interesting happens for this ODE problem, or not very much interesting happens. If I were to, I don't have a tipping point. If I look at the periodic case, basically if I decrease the amount of water I'm putting in, just gradually the amount of biomass decreases until it hits zero. So it's like a transcritical bifurcation, it just goes down. The random case, it does almost the exact same thing. It just decreases, and then it hits zero. I'm looking at like a mean. I could calculate, I wander this for a long time. I calculate a mean biomass, so that's what's being plotted there. And I can calculate where that's going to hit zero. Okay. So it's just shifted slightly, but otherwise it looks quite similar. What I really want to do is to look at this spatially heterogeneous case. And the questions that we're asking is like, how is storm variability going to impact that onset of patterns? And also, well, I don't know how to do a Busa balloon, but something like a Busa balloon, this metastable region where I have all these different coexisting patterns. And I'm going to compare this periodic reliable case with the random case for those. Okay, so first I want to talk about the onset of patterns. That's an instability of a spatially uniform state. Okay, so I linearize my problem about a spatially uniform solution. I ask, well, if I put a little cosine perturbation on it, does that cosine grow or decay? Okay, so there it is. I'm going to get a linear stability problem for how does my cosine grow or decay in one kick flow cycle. Okay, so I've got this map, my kick flow map, and it's quite interesting in the random case because what does this depend on? It depends on my base state. I'm linearizing about something, but I showed you like that linear, I'm like wandering all over phase space. So I've got some distribution there associated with that base state. Then I also have randomness in these rainfall parameters. So the way that I think about this is that in order to calculate the linear stability in this random case, I'm going to draw one map from this distribution. Then I'm going to draw another map from that distribution. So it's a random dynamical system, random linear dynamical system. I could just keep doing this and calculate something like a Lyapunov exponent for that. So that's what we do computationally, is we just calculate what is this mean growth rate of a perturbation as a function of k and other parameters. Okay. Okay, so I want, let me just check. I can't remember what he told me, whether he was going to give me an hour or 15. Okay, I think I'm fine. Okay. First, I want to talk about the case of periodic kicks, this irrigation case where I'm putting in water predictably. And in that case, I just need to do one of these kick flow maps, and I can calculate a flow K multiplier associated with that. It's a periodically forced system. I calculate flow K multipliers to determine stability. And so we've done that, and this is a heat map of that flow K multiplier as a function of the precipitation, mean annual precipitation, and as a function of the wave number of the perturbation. And what we find, and this we didn't anticipate, was that the linear stability problem led to something that, if I look like this, it looks to me like resonance tongues. If you've ever studied like a Matthew equation or, the swing set, you're forcing it, parametrically forced systems, you get these resonance tongues. And the way you get resonance tongues is that there's some inherent frequency in the problem. And the resonance is you're somehow forcing it in resonance with that. And so we had to understand, like, why are we getting resonance tongues here? There's spatial resonance tongues. And these white lines on these tongues, like this region is unstable. The next one, it's unstable, stable, unstable, this sort of alternation. The white line is a back-of-the-envelope calculation. And what the length is it's the distance water deposited on the surface will travel before it fully infiltrates. And so what's going on is that the ideal spacing for these bands to get this resonance is that you want to space them so that if I'm the band, I can harvest the water from the upslope bare region. Okay, so I would like the bands to be like sort of half a wavelength of that. Like I take the bare, so the water hitting the bare soil, it infiltrates over here in the band. These additional bands, you move them closer together, and now I take water from not like immediately upslope, but I go like through one band up to the next one. Okay, so we understood like there's some length scale in this problem. So that's why I don't like to call it a Turing bifurcation, because it's not like a Turing bifurcation. It's more like a force system. Okay, so here's the question we ask. Having understood that, here's my bifurcation diagram. I decrease the amount of water. I'm moving down that blue branch, and then suddenly it becomes unstable to patterns. So that's I hit this instability boundary. Uniform state is unstable. It forms patterns. And what I want to know is what happens in the case where I have variable storms. I put in this randomness. And I want to know, I know I'm going to get patterns because I showed you I got them. Is that point of forming patterns, is it going to move up the branch or down the branch? I can argue for both cases. I don't know if anybody has ever done this, and you're doing a problem, and you think, it'll turn out to be this, or it'll turn out to be this, and I've got the argument for both. Okay. My argument that it should move up is that when these systems, when they're stressed, patterns are like a good thing. Like they help save the system. They help evade tipping. They do all these wonderful things. So and variability's a form of stress. I'm going to get to the patterns earlier. So that's the moving up. The moving down argument is patterns rely on having a lot of regularity in the system. Like that whole field relied on these really pristine settings of studying, convection and things like that, really well-controlled things. And putting in variability is not going to be good. It's going to move down. Okay, so what do we see? It moves down. Okay, I'll just tell you that. So what I'm showing here are two different examples. I'm decreasing the total amount of rainfall that's coming in. And in this first column, what I'm doing is, the way I'm doing that is I'm fixing the mean storm size to be 1 centimeter as the mean storm's strength in that exponential distribution. And I'm just going to make the storms more dry periods between storms. Lengthen the waiting time, and then you'll hit patterns. In this one, what we do is we keep the mean waiting time between storms the same, and we decrease how big the storms are. So that's another way you could decrease the amount of rainfall in a year. So we get these resonance tongues in both cases. We can calculate the spines of them. We can do all sorts of things. And these bottom plots were our effort to calculate those leading Lyapunov exponents from those in that random setting. And so we get some boundaries. They actually look so similar. If I do one experiment or the other experiment, they're quite similar. The onset is kind of identical between them, but the thing is they've shrunk. So you have to stress the system more before you form patterns. Okay, so that's my punchline. It decreases. That's the answer that we got here. This is another effort to show that calculating those boundaries in this mean time between storms and mean storm height, and you got this big triangle of patterns. If you have periodic rainfall, and that triangle sort of shrinks by a factor of 2 when I put in the randomness. Okay, then there's this other thing that was in that paper, which was this Busa balloon. I don't know how to calculate anything like a Busa balloon in this random setting. I'm probably not alone in not knowing how to do that. Even in the regular case, it's there's a lot of people who have developed really good, continuation schemes for tracking, where are these spatially periodic patterns stable. Okay, so those are not easy calculations in that setting. So what we do, and it's kind of reflected in, if you look at that diagram, there are these red lines and green lines. That's just saying if you ramped the system, ramped the rainfall down and ramped it back up, what would you get? So that's what we can do. We did 50 trials. Maybe that's not enough, but that's kind of what we did, these ramping experiments. So you have some ramping rate and everything like that. And basically, if you do periodic, you get that big gray region. So that's like that. And if you do random, it shrinks. So it shrinks not only on that upper and where you form the patterns. And it seems to be nearly supercritical, or is supercritical bifurcation to the pattern states. The region where they collapse also shrinks. So the amount of evasion I'm getting is less in this case. There's also two colors in this. There's like a dark green and a light green. Light green means that some of the trials had patterns, but not all of them. The dark green means all 50 trials had patterns. And we can check our agreement with that linear stability calculation. It seems to be, it's good. Okay, oh, wait. Oh, sorry. Now I'm like, this is the backwards. Okay. That's all. But now I'm going to speculate. Okay, so we're at the speculative part. Andrea Liu called this dipping below the bullshit line or something. Okay, I'm not doing that, but I'm going to speculate a bit, okay, because it's the end of the day and we're among friends. Okay, so one thing I want to claim with very little basis, but that I'm really interested in, is an idea that this random case is actually simpler. It's not simpler mathematically or computationally. We had to work much harder to get things. There are a bunch of things I don't know how to calculate. And so I don't mean simpler in that sense. But I want to just point out one thing here. This is comparing these instability regions. And what I'm attempting to plot on the right-hand side is something like that Busa balloon. It's what is the predicted, what is the number of bands on a kilometer domain? Okay, so that would be like that Busa balloon in this direction, the characterization of the pattern, and then there's the other direction. So there's the white line, which was my back of the envelope estimate of what that length scale would be. There's a black dashed line. That black dashed line is just saying what's the most unstable mode. Okay, so onset, it should work pretty well, getting the most unstable mode for the pattern formation problem. And then we've got red dots and blue dots that are scattered all over the place. It's like, turns out this system is hugely sensitive. This idealized perfect rainfall thing with all these resonance times, it's like super sensitive to how I do things. And I'll show that in the next slide as well. So we get this scatter. The other thing is that the linear stability calculation maybe predicts, okay, that onset wave number, it otherwise is terrible. Okay, I turn to my, these are vertical lines because there were 50 trials, so we've got like a range of wave numbers. I'm plotting these both on the same scale. This eventually settled down into something that has nothing to do with the linear stability calculation, where you're getting like 5, 10 bands on the domain. That's all I got here in the random case, was that region that was actually, here's the linear prediction. There's no reason this should work, but it seems to really not be bad. I have no justification for it not being, or I don't understand why it's working so well. Maybe it's a fluke. But the linear theories seem to work pretty well. So it's in that sense, I want to say it's simpler. The other thing is, okay, there's a lot in this, but I was saying that there's all this scatter of these points, like it's all over the place. And that's because it's really sensitive. We're doing things with periodic boundary conditions. It's really sensitive to the precise size of domain because of all this resonance features. And so I find that, like, if I do one storm, these are all the same mean annual precipitation. I'm changing the typical storm size, and it is, oh wait, am I over? No, it's counting down still. Okay, the periodic rainfall is just like really sensitive, and sometimes it's traveling in the wrong direction, and sometimes it's not forming bands. If it like maybe it'd say, oh, that's a very nice example of bands, but I show it with this other one. You say that one's terrible. This one's really bad. That one's like way off. When I did it with the random thing, it's much nicer. They travel in the right direction. They have the right characteristic speeds and characteristic wavelengths. So it's in that sense I'm saying it's somehow simpler. It's behaving in a better way. I would like to know how to get to that reduced model associated with it. I don't know how to do that. So there's mathematical questions I'm interested in. I think some of them are not easy. Okay. Now, this has been an entirely a talk about modeling, and so you might want me to go back and say, what do I actually think somebody should measure? And I just have a couple of thoughts on that. So one, okay, actually, if I look at something like this, it looks like these are kind of traveling uphill, but they're fluctuating, the width of these bands. So I might say like, oh, I kind of blurred. It's got like some speed and it's got some fluctuation. So one thing I know that you can do is you can measure the width of the bands. And the reason I know this is that this Carnegauda, who was my student back a long time ago when we first started this line of work, did that. You know, he found these old photographs, he found the modern satellite images, and he looked at band by band what happened. You know, so he built something that could measure these things. 576 bands at one location measuring this. So that, I think, is possible. You could take satellite data, climate or weather data, and start looking at fluctuations in the width of these bands and how that's related to weather. So that's something I know is possible. At least if you're Carnegauda, it's possible. And hopefully there are other thing I want to mention here, his paper was Signatures of Human Impact on Self-Organized Vegetation, the Horn of Africa. What he did was he realized that at some locations, the bands, they didn't change at all. Like 50, 60 years, they're identical. Same width, everything is the same. They just moved a little bit, except there were like 3 sites where that was not true. There were also like people that popped up in those places. So like studying things like desertification, it's about human land use. So that's what that paper was about. Another thing that was kind of, Thomas, you were asking maybe about this, that the other opportunity I see is in thinking about interactions with the landscape. So here are just 2 images. This one is from Ethiopia, and so you see this confinement of the patterns. And you also see that they have some shape. And McFadden talked about this, like the shape of the bands and how they're oriented on the landscape. And he says, oh, they're convex upslope. If you look at these ones in Australia, you'd say, okay, that must be the upslope direction. Then you switch to this other thing and you say, no, like the opposite direction is upslope. Okay, so there's elevation data. So we've done a tiny bit around this, like combining observations with elevation data, which is important for water flow. And so you can see that that region in Australia, like the bands kind of follow the elevation contours. So they're oriented one way if the bands are located on ridges and another way if they're located in valleys. Okay, so that's it. I mentioned 5 papers, 2 old ones and 3 that was like a series, more recent things. And I wanted to just mention that these were, I highlighted the lead author on these papers. Puneet Gandhi has been my collaborator for a number of years on this work. We first started working together when he was a mathematical biosciences postdoc at Ohio State. And you could have a mentor who was not there. I was lucky enough to be his mentor, and we started this really nice collaboration on this topic. The other person I mentioned was Carnegauda, was the PhD student I worked with when this work first started, and he really gave me a lot of courage to do things I wouldn't have otherwise done. And Carna got a PhD in applied math. Then he went on. He's now, coincidentally, he's at Ohio State, and he's an assistant professor in microbiology. So this is an example. He started working with Sepa Kuhn and Madhav Mani on microbial ecology. Maybe Kisak, does he work with you? Maybe. But yeah, anyway, Karna is an example of somebody that took this training in applied math and decided, okay, I don't really like this kind of ecology. There's not controlled experiments, the timescales are wrong, and he's doing experimental work in this. So, and then the last thing I'd mention is that this work, I really like doing this because it brings together two of my communities. I'm part of this Math and Climate Research Network, and then also the NITMB. So, okay, and I used up all my time. But you guys asked questions during it, so. Oh, no, I didn't even go into question time. We still have time for questions. Yes.
In agricultural settings, sometimes the models include the microbiome, the soil microbiome, right? And that sometimes is very important to determine colonization of.
Yeah.
So do you think that your models should include the specific terms on the microbiome, or do you think that
Do you mean like the termites? Are you talking about termites?
No, I'm talking about, for example, nitrogen-fixing
Okay,
bacteria,
yeah. Okay,
fungal
okay.
mycorrhizae that
Right,
interact
right.
with the roots of the plants.
No, I don't think we should include that.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, it would just be so complicated for me. For the kind of questions I'm asking. I mean, the only thing I would say in that regard is that there are these like ecological stations where they measure these things, right? So there is data associated with it. The worry I have is that you make the model so complicated that you can't learn things from it. And really what I'm doing is very conceptual. I'm not making predictions. I'm just trying to look at develop a framework where I might look at variability. But yeah, no, there's lots of things you could bring in, and I could list. Like you mentioned one. I'll say, oh, but what about the shading from the canopy? And then we could play. Yeah, so there's lots of things neglected. I will absolutely say that.
Yeah, I just think it's really interesting that your models recapitulate the real data so well without including explicitly a term from the microbiome. And in other places, like in agriculture, that seems to be like really important. So this might be an example where the microbiome might not be that relevant.
Yeah. Okay. We can talk. Cody.
Do you ever think of, I think they're called Stratstrugai,
The what guy?
Stratstrugai, and so you have similar patterns. If I have a field of snow and the wind comes in,
Yeah.
I wonder similar mechanisms, or
Right,
could you?
yeah. So early on in this field, there was a lot of discussion about whether these patterns were associated with wind. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I was wondering, because in that case, right, you could maybe test things more experimentally if you had like a snow and wind type system, and it was a similar kind of mechanism to get at the questions you're interested in.
Snow?
Right, like the ripples through the snow caused by the wind.
You're making me switch problems. You guys, like, old lady up here, like, yeah, okay, yeah. Oh, but I was going to say that there was a time that people thought maybe these were influenced by wind, and there was like a lot of back and forth and literature around that from like the 50s and 60s, and they had to like find locations where they would say, this is definitely not because of the wind direction, yeah. Oni. I'm hard of hearing, so I always have to walk around.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can actually, because you're using the microphone.
That's very nice. I was wondering, so have you seen the, preventing desertification of the Gobi Desert in China and can like similar things be done to prevent
Right.
aridification?
So one of the people who's quite active in this modeling area is Ehud Meron. So he's a theoretical physicist in Israel. So he's really tried to advocate for using some of these self-organization ideas to come up with management strategies. And that would be good luck to him. I don't think people are going to do it based on these models. I think we would need to do some small scale experiments around that, you know. Yeah. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how much. Nature is inspiring, right? So you could just say, like, okay, nature likes these wavelengths. Let's try to promote that and give it some patches to harvest from. Yes.
Some of the patterns you were showing looked like Wolfram cellular automata, but maybe I was imagining it. Did you ever observe those traveling wave also bifurcate to branch off, or they were just going one-dimensionally in time and space?
The real ones or the
Well, in your
simulations?
model, because
Oh, in a
sometimes
model that can do all sorts of things, yeah. Like in the case where it was periodically driven, we would get all sorts of things. And as people that, Puneet and I both have this background in pattern formation, and we would have to control ourselves and not get lost in understanding every, like, oh, this like weird pattern, and let's study it, you know. But yeah,
in
they
real
do
data,
like, they're trying to adjust, and so it starts traveling the wrong way. It splits apart.
I see.
Yeah, so I think, as a system that creates complicated patterns in a very sensitive way, I've got it for you. I mean, you have your own, I'm sure, but yeah. Joe.
From the image, it appears that the shape, the concavity, really affects the amount of biomass that is grown in that area. Obviously, that's not what you're modeling, but I am curious.
Well, no, I actually am quite interested in that
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, because like that can really dictate, and then obviously that might answer the
Right.
other question you had, or didn't have, was like, what about different regions, and why are you having that different patterns or
Right.
different structure?
Right. Yeah. No. One of the things that we're struggling with right now, but that I like as a problem, is just to say what is an optimal shape. If I say, you know, should I be like this crescent shape? I think it's very much influenced by the landscape. But I could say with this landscape, how should I distribute things? It's not just how sloped it is, but it's also like that it's in a valley line. So I could take that. So we are doing some things like calculating kind of an efficiency of gathering the water for different shapes, and so and different storms. So I do have some projects along those lines. They don't have a clear message just yet, but I think it's going to be so fun, like optimizing over shapes, you know. Yeah. Okay. Kisak.
With the data we have throughout looking at the shapes from the 1950s to the 2020, can we infer whether the rain was random or it was periodic?
I know it's not periodic. Yeah. I mean, I don't have to do that to know that it's not periodic. Yeah. And I don't think, yeah. So what I would really like to do if I had like another Karna, or if we could clone him, I would love to look at that. You know, I think of it like there is more information. Like I was thinking, there's topography. We have that data, and that's very influential. Rainfall time series is very influential. I think that's less well collected, but there's some, you know, and I think there are efforts at sort of using satellites to measure precipitation at some level. So there's just lots of amazing global data sets available at finer and finer resolution. Some of it is proprietary, though. So the thing that Karna had to do was he had to approach these companies and say, I'm just like a PhD student, can you just give me some of this? And they said yes, and you say that you got a grant from us. But yeah, so I think that the good data is not as freely available. Yeah.
So I just want to make sure. It seems like you need the ambient infiltration rate to be very low, and then it's specifically a lot higher where there's vegetation.
Right. We put in two things, and I only really need one of them. We were thinking specifically about this runoff, run-on kind of mechanism. So we put in two feedbacks. One is that we said bare soil does not infiltrate as easily as vegetated soil. And I think people have seen that. Like if you're like, there's a storm in a dry region, you see it like sort of pooling up on the asphalt or not asphalt, but whatever. So that was one. We had a infiltration contrast between bare and vegetated. The other thing is that we said that there's surface roughness effects. So if it's bare soil, it travels much faster down slope. The surface water travels very rapidly over bare soil. And then when it hits like that lady in the shrubs, this overland flow is going to slow down. And some of the explanation they have for why the slope has to have kind of a sweet spot is they describe it like, overland surface flow, like sheet flow. And you're not going to get that on a big slope. It's going to end up creating channels. So, yeah. Okay, we're out of here.